Imagine you just finished growing your Ceratosaurus to adulthood and got yourself a perfect diet. Things are going great. But as you're walking through the jungle of Gateway, you hear... Little did you know you just walked right into a group of Pachycephalosaurus, and are about to refamiliarize yourself with the character select screen. These scenarios are one of the most frustrating to deal with, and lead many people to believe that Pachycephalosaurus is extremely oppressive and overtuned. In this video, I'll be looking at Pachycephalosaurus as a playable, discussing what makes it feel so oppressive, and pointing out areas that need improving, to try and provide feedback on how this playable can be improved to feel good to play as, while not being nearly as infuriating to play against. In terms of damage, it is comparable to Dilophosaurus and Omniraptor, which in my opinion is a bit strange, since this main attack demands a lot of commitment from the user, as it locks you in place after the attack is finished, regardless if it lands or not, and is extremely easy to predict. Not to mention that it freaks out when you try to use it while going uphill, or it just doesn't land straight up. Pachycephalosaurus starts to become oppressive when you aren't faster than it, playing as the two playables that are big enough to avoid being fractured by it as adults, or if you don't have the numbers advantage. And you better pray that Donnie descends from the heavens above and grants you invincibility if you check all three of these boxes, because you're about to receive a one-way ticket back to the character select screen in the next couple minutes. So what exactly makes Pachycephalosaurus so oppressive in a group, and to think slower than it despite the issues it has? I believe that how fractures are set up right now, along with other mechanics like stamina regeneration and the wounded system, is what enables Pachycephalosaurus to be so oppressive in certain circumstances. While the original conception for fractures centered around Pachy landing fractures to escape from predators it couldn't otherwise fend off, the debuffs they apply are really abusable, especially when it hurts. There are currently 3 different types of fractures in the Isle. Head fractures, having the damage of bite attacks, enable Pachycephalosaurus to tank damage it otherwise shouldn't. This problem is amplified when you factor in the harsh damage debuff that comes with being on red HP thanks to the wounded system. The concussed effect being at a constant potency even if you aren't moving at all feels a bit overkill and is extremely disorientating. Increasing stamina drain by 3 times, body fractures, while being the least immediately oppressive of the 3 fracture types, over time enable Pachy's run down players until they are completely gassed out. Body fractures could feel extremely frustrating to deal with, as they could severely hamper your ability to try and escape or defend yourself, due to the increased stamina cost. Adding on to this, if you are below 25% stamina, you aren't able to regenerate any stamina back, unless you are resting, which essentially traps you in the location of wherever you gassed out. And that brings us to leg fractures. My gripes don't stem from the fact that they slow you down, although I think the slowdown effect should be lowered a bit. It's the fact they disable ult attacks altogether, and that they can only be healed off when resting. The fact that leg fractures disable most ult attacks allows Pachy to essentially sit on the ass of most playables without much consequence. And the fact that playables are forced to sit down to heal off the fractures gives Pachys all the time in the world to keep bullying whatever they fractured without the animal being able to chase them down and punish them for trying to stick around. The last thing worth mentioning about fractures is their duration. Some can last close to 5 minutes long before the debuffs subside. Now that I've gone over my gripes with the current fracture debuffs and other offending mechanics, I wanted to propose some alterations to fractures that would still make them significant enough to be noticeable, but not nearly as abusable as current fractures are. Before I propose my changes to each type of fracture, I want to review some general fracture and mechanic changes that I would like to see implemented to help with fractures feeling super oppressive. For starters, fractures shouldn't last any longer than 3 minutes and should heal faster when resting. Next, I would like to see the damage reduction debuff from being in the wounded state removed, and have the threshold to get wounded lowered from being just below half HP to being at around 30% HP or lower, or having the wounded status effect removed altogether. Lastly, I would like to see the inability to regenerate stamina unless you are resting when at 25% stamina or lower flat out removed, and allow all playables to regenerate stamina when walking or standing still, no matter how much stamina they have left. Now that I've reviewed my preferred changes to fracture's duration, the wounded status effect, and stamina regen threshold, it's time to discuss the changes I'd like to see made to the different fracture types. Starting with head fractures. For head fractures, I would remove the damage reduction debuff flat out and instead make head fractures worsen the cooldowns between head-based attacks and disable tracking. The concussed effect would still be applied at max potency upon receiving a head fracture. However, if the player stops running, either stands still, walks, or trots, the concussed effect would subside and only cover the very edges of the player's screen. But if the player starts running, the effect will build up in intensity the longer the player runs. This change would allow for Pachycephalosaurus to be able to lose predators after landing a head fracture, by denying them the ability to track them down and worsening their vision if they attempt to keep chasing after it. On the flip side, the fact that the victim's damage isn't reduced, nor will they have their vision impaired as harshly if they don't run, would make it much harder for the Pachycephalosaurus to try and tank damage and abuse the victim's impaired vision as easily as they can currently. Moving on to body fractures, I would first lower how much body fractures increase your stamina cost by, from 3 times to 1.5 times, and allow body fractures to worsen the victim's sprinting agility. The reason for these changes is to allow the Pachycephalosaurus to use its better agility to escape from predators while not catastrophically tanking their stamina if it decides to run for more than 5 seconds, or use attacks that cost stamina without having to worry about gassing out after using them a couple times to defend themselves. This brings us to leg fractures. For this fracture type, I would allow non-kick alt attacks to be usable when the victim's leg is fractured, then decrease the speed debuff percentage to 25% on average, while other times it would be 30% for animals like Carnotaurus or subadult T-Rex. And finally, let players heal their leg fractures while standing still. Enabling alt attacks would stop Pachys from standing directly behind players with a leg fracture without much worry. Decreasing the potency of the speed debuff would mean that Pachycephalosaurus can't just stand right in front of something with a leg fracture without much care, since whatever they have leg fractured will be far slower than they are. The ability to regen fractures while standing still gives players stuck standing a chance to make a comeback, if they could keep the multiple Pachycephalosaurus attacking them from hitting their legs again. Now that I have gone over the changes I would like to see implemented for fractures, I want to review some changes I would make to Pachycephalosaurus. For starters, I would let an adult Pachycephalosaurus run when a single adult Omniraptor pounces onto it. This gives Pachy a chance to try and use the environment assets to knock off the Omniraptor or get to a better position to stop other packmates from jumping on top of it. The next thing I touch upon would be Pachy's ram. The movement lock at the end of the ram should be removed entirely, or at the very least removed when you land a successful ram. I also think that ram's unreliability needs to be looked into and given a similar treatment to Omniraptor's pounce, where it could still land when attacking uphill. I would increase the charged ram's max damage to 175 damage and make the downwards ram deal 225 damage. This would allow Pachy to deal heavy damage to anything it manages to knock over. Lastly, I would increase its alt head swing damage to 85 or 105 damage. These changes would make it a menace to things its size and scary to larger animals if in a group. To clarify, I don't mind Pachycephalosaurus being scary in groups or to things around its size, as it makes sense for the animal. My problems before stemmed from how Pachy currently scares things in groups. With the changes I suggested for fractures, Pachy would strike a good balance of being scary prey to go after while still not being oppressive. That about wraps up this video. I would be interested to hear what you guys think. Any constructive feedback would be greatly appreciated, or consider liking the video or subscribing to help support the channel. Thanks for watching. Thank you very much for watching.